They say curiosity killed the cat, but in my neighborhood, it was a lavender bathrobe and a god complex that finally did in the woman we all called the queen of the cul-de-sac. Most people think their HOA is just a bunch of retired folks arguing over the shade of beige on your shutters. But in our little slice of suburban Oregon, it was more like living under a high-stakes dictatorship where the secret police wore slippers and carried a clipboard. I'm telling you this because for 3 years, I lived in fear of Brenda, a woman who treated our bylaws like the Ten Commandments and herself like the burning bush. But little did she know that the moment she reached in my mailbox, she wasn't just violating my privacy, she was declaring war on the federal government. It all started with a series of small, maddening gaps in my life, the kind of things you brush off because you don't want to be the, in quote, crazy neighbor, in quote, who complains about the wind. First, it was a utility bill that never showed, then a localized newsletter, but then it got personal on my sister's birthday card, the one she sends every year with a $20 bill tucked inside. Didn't an oppose to arrive? I initially chalked it up to a new mail carrier or maybe the chaotic weather we'd been having, but then I got a notice from the IRS claiming they'd sent a document I never saw, and suddenly the hair on the back of my neck stood up. You know that feeling when you realize the world ISN and oppose. Just messy and oppose. As being manipulated? I started looking around my driveway, checking the hinges on my box, and noticing that the little red flag was occasionally down when I knew I and oppose. D left it up. So, on a Tuesday morning around 5 a.m., I did what any self-respecting, sleep-deprived American would do. I brewed a pot of the strongest coffee I had, turned off every light in the front of the house, and sat by the curtains like a character in a noir film. The neighborhood was dead silent, just that pre-dawn blue light filtering through the Douglas firs. And then I saw it, a flash of pale purple moving across the asphalt. It was Brenda, our HOA president. She was power walking in her slippers, her bathrobe tied tight, and she didn't oppose to even look around to see if anyone was watching because she truly believed she owned the air we breathed. I watched, my heart hammering against my ribs, as she reached my mailbox, flipped it open with a practiced flick of the wrist, and began leafing through my mail like she was checking her own social media feed. She pulled out 2 envelopes, tucked them into her robe pocket, and just walked away, headed toward the next house on the strip. I wanted to burst through the door and scream. I wanted to tackle her right there on the sidewalk, but something stopped me, a cold, calculated realization that if I confronted her now, she'd just lie, call me a harasser, and use her position on the board to make my life a living hell. The next night at the monthly HOA meeting, I sat in the back, watching her sit at that long table with her pearls and her perfectly coiffed hair, lecturing a young couple about the, in quote, unacceptable, in quote, height of their dandelions. When the floor opened for comments, I stood up, my voice steady but my pulse racing, and simply asked if anyone else had been experiencing issues with missing mail lately. Brenda didn't oppose to even blink. She just tilted her head, gave me this pitying, saccharine smile that didn't oppose. T reached her eyes and said, in quote, "Oh, Marshall, you know how unreliable the Postal Service has become since the pandemic. Perhaps if you spent more time securing your documents and less time worrying about the neighbors, you wouldn't oppose. T have these lapses," in quote. The room went quiet, and in that moment, I saw the flicker of triumph in her eyes. She wasn't oppose. T just stealing my mail. She was feeding on the control she had over my peace of mind. That was the turning point for me because I realized Brenda didn't oppose. T just wanted my letters. She wanted to know my business so she could use it against me. And that's when I decided to call on the professionals. Most people don't oppose. T realized that the United States Postal Inspection Service is one of the oldest and most aggressive law enforcement agencies in the country, and they do not have a sense of humor when it comes to 18 U.S.C. Section 1708. I got a hold of an inspector named Miller, a guy who sounded like he'd spent 20 years smelling old ink and chasing down scammers. And when I told him what I saw, he didn't oppose. T laughed. He got very, very quiet. He told me that mail theft is a felony that carries up to 5 years in federal prison per count, and if I was willing to play ball, they were going to set up a, in quote, controlled delivery, in quote, that would end Brenda's reign once and for all. The plan was beautiful in its simplicity. Miller and his team arrived at my house in the middle of the night in a plain white van, looking more like plumbers than federal agents. And they handed me the bait, a thick, official-looking envelope addressed to me from a fictional law firm. Inside, tucked between two pieces of cardstock, was a GPS trigger, a tiny device that would alert their handheld monitors the moment the envelope was moved or opened. I felt like I was in a spy movie, my palms sweating as I placed that envelope in my box and walked back inside, knowing that by sunrise, the trap would be set. I didn't end Oppos, sleep a wink. I just sat there, watching the clock tick toward 5:30, wondering if Brenda would show up or if she'd somehow sense the shift in the atmosphere. Sure enough, like clockwork, the lavender robe appeared through the mist. She looked so smug, so entirely convinced of her own invincibility as she reached into my mailbox and snatched the law firm envelope. I could see her thumbing the weight of it, her curiosity clearly piqued by the legal documents stamp on the front, and then she vanished back into her house. My phone buzzed. It was Miller, parked 3 houses down in a tinted SUV, telling me the tracker was active and that they were moving in. I watched from my porch as 3 vehicles quietly boxed in her driveway, and for a few minutes, there was nothing but the sound of the wind, until the signal confirmed the envelope had been opened inside her kitchen. That was the green light. I followed at a distance as Miller and his partners walked up to her front door and knocked with a force that seemed to shake the entire cul-de-sac. When Brenda opened the door, still in that robe, clutching the opened GPS letter in one hand and a mug of tea in the other, her face went from annoyed to ghostly pale in 3 seconds flat. Miller didn't end Oppos. Waste time. He flashed his badge and told her she was being detained for the theft of United States mail. I'll never forget the sound of her voice, that high-pitched, screeching tone she used to use on us, as she shouted, "I am the president of this association. I have the right to monitor the safety of this community. You can Oppos, do this," But as the handcuffs clicked shut over her wrists, Miller just looked at her and said, "Mon Oppos, your HOA bylaws don and Oppos. Override the federal government. You and Oppos, we're going to want to dress a little more comfortably for processing." By the time they led her down the driveway, half the neighborhood was on their lawns, phones out, capturing the fall of the Queen. She looked small, she looked pathetic, and for the first time in years, the air in our neighborhood felt like it belonged to us again. Within 48 hours, the HOA board had called an emergency session to strip her of her title and distance themselves from the legal nightmare she'd created. And as it turned out, I wasn't into Oppos, her only victim. They found a literal mountain of neighbors and Oppos, mail stashed in her basement, everything from bank statements to wedding invitations. She wasn't into Oppos, just a thief. She was a hoarder of secrets, a woman who used our private lives to keep us under her thumb. Now, as I sit on my porch and watch the mail truck roll by, I don an Oppos. Feel that spike of anxiety anymore because I know that justice ISN into Oppos. Always fast, but when it's delivered by a federal inspector, it's absolute. Brenda is currently facing a mountain of charges, and the last I heard, she's looking at a plea deal that involves a very long time away from any kind of committee. It makes you wonder, though, how well do you actually know the people who run your neighborhood? Is that helpful neighbor just being kind, or are they waiting for you to look away so they can take a piece of your life for themselves? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever had an HOA horror story that went too far? Or do you think I should have just confronted her myself and kept the feds out of it? Let me know, and Don and Oppos. Forget to check your mailbox tonight. You never know who might be watching.